They've been at it for 15, 20 years. And maybe they've checked all the boxes, right? They got the degree, they did the advanced training, maybe they got board certified, they've been promoted several times within the organization. But they look up and it's like, I still got 15 or 20 years left and I feel like I've arrived. I feel like I've checked all the boxes, like what else? And this question, I think, very much comes to the surface at this point, right? Who am I beyond my role as a pharmacist? I've been thinking a lot about the sunk cost involved in the pharmacy education and training. Investment of time, obviously, to get the degree or do some training beyond the degree. Investment of money, we've talked about that at length on the show, and even just the emotional investment that's made over multiple years through that training period. And I think naturally, because of that sunk cost, because of that investment, for many pharmacists, their career becomes more than a job. And career would imply that, right? More than a job. But even further than that, it become a big part of how they see themselves, and identity is wrapped up in their role as a pharmacist. And that really is the topic of what we're going to talk about here on today's show. As the non-pharmacist in the conversation, I certainly have an opinion on this, and we'll get to that. But I'm so curious, as a non-pharmacist who has had so many conversations with pharmacists over the years, why do you think? What do you see in terms of why pharmacists are susceptible to this enmeshment of identity and their role as a pharmacist, and why does it become such an important issue when we talk about things like money and financial planning and retirement planning?
Yeah, I think that this is a very important topic that doesn't get talked about at all. And I actually use this as a differentiator. I'll say something to the effect of, like, when I'm talking about my profession as a financial planner, I'll say something like, hey, unlike becoming a PharmD, which is a lot of blood, sweat, tears, time, money, to become a financial advisor, there isn't that sunk cost fallacy. It's hey, you can study for 12 weeks, pass a license exam, and you can do exactly what we do. So the barrier to entry in financial planning is very low, which often leads to the profession being littered with salespeople that are just hawking products, right? Life insurance, financial. So that's not the case in pharmacy. Like, you have to commit yourself at a pretty young age. And for most people, right, you can be a career changer. And I think for a lot of people, it is the time, but it's the dollars. We talk about student loans all the time. It's the amount of money that, it takes, whether it's loans or not. It could be, money from a fight. It's just,
Sure.
it's a lot of money. So, and I think sometimes what I've seen is pharmacists get out of school, they'll get into their job. Maybe it's a job that they're like, I don't know if I can do this for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And
they're in year 1 or 2 or 3,
yeah,
right?
and I have
Yeah.
$200,000 to pay off, and maybe I'm standing behind a bench and I'm dealing with insurance and all that kind of stuff, or whatever, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that can be scary as hell, Tim. That can be frustrating. That can be just really hard to go overcome. I think the money thing is real, but I also think the identity and role stuff is real too. So, like, one of we talked about, I think briefly on the show before, like IR theory. So
Yeah.
IR theory is this sociological framework that examines a person's identity. So who am I, and their roles? What am I expected to do? And
Yep.
how that shapes behavior. So it argues that you simply don't act on your personality traits. So, like, I feel like I'm pretty introverted, I think, by nature. But like, when I identify myself as, like, a West Point graduate, a leader in the Army, I have to stretch more into that extrovert and put myself out there. When I was in that part of that, when that was an identity for me. And they basically, the theory suggests that the stronger a particular identity is, the more likely that we're we are going to behave in ways that reinforce the identity. So, and the interesting thing about this, Tim, is that we have multiple identities, right? So myself, I'm a husband, I'm a parent, business owner, financial planner, kind of, friend, son, cousin, nephew, obnoxious Philly sports fan, so maybe I need to be more obnoxious about my fandom. So these things are all intertwined, and it kind of shapes our behavior and how we, how we kind of traverse through the world. And, I was talking about this with Shay recently, our identity as like parent, sometimes like we can get so focused on that we
Yeah,
forget that we're also spouse, like husband and
totally.
wife. And then like when the kids leave, right? Because one of the things that we'll talk about here is that things change. Even your role as a pharmacist or your identity as a pharmacist change. Like you got to be able to overcome that. And I think a lot of parents sometimes struggle with that because the kids are now gone. And it's like,
Yeah.
hey, Shay, I'm Tim. Nice to meet you again, because we've been so focused on that identity as parent versus, and not necessarily as, husband and wife and that type of thing. So I think it's something that we need to talk about more, because I think, and we'll talk about this in the context of retirement. Retirement, for a lot of people, we think of it strictly as financial, but we don't think of it as like the exit of role of a pharmacist and how that affects us and our ability to kind of traverse into that next chapter.
And just to build on what you're saying there, I love that you brought forward the IR theory. We didn't plan this in advance, so it's fun to see where the conversation's
Yeah.
going to go. Is the way I think about the IR theory, the identity and role, is that the further there's enmeshment in the identity and the role, then the harder the separation becomes of those. So let me give the parent examples you were just kind of playing on, or even the marriage example. Like on any given day, I might feel one day like I'm a 10 out of 10 as a parent, as a father. And then another day I might feel like I'm a 4 out of 10, right? Just based on the dynamics and how that day goes. And that really is independent of the identity. The identity should remain unchanged, but the more those are enmeshed, meaning that I hang my hat, my identity, all on the value of how I'm performing in that role, that's where things get really sticky, right? And if we apply that to a pharmacist, we're naturally going to have seasons of work, of career, some that are going to go better than others, some jobs that we may like more than others. Eventually, we're not going to be a pharmacist at some point, even if we stay involved, right? Associations have a retired pharmacist membership category, but there's going to be a point in time when we no longer have that pharmacist title. And, even throughout one's career, there could be career transitions or pivots or things that the more those are enmeshed, the harder it becomes to separate out, or in those seasons or in those jobs or in those roles where things maybe aren't going how we want them to go, we can see the role creep, if you will, into the identity, component. And I find this fascinating, Tim, because when I think back to my own pharmacy journey, I went to a direct entry 06 PharmD program out of high school. I had no identity role enmeshment of being a pharmacist, but I would suspect, as is the case in other maybe advanced degrees where, I remember going to Ohio Northern. It's a 06 PharmD program. Day one, you're taking pharmacy classes about what does it mean to be a pharmacist? How do you act as a pharmacist, right? What is your role as a pharmacist? And you can understand why that professional identity comes in so quickly. But let me give an example of where the transition part I think can be difficult. I remember vividly a moment I was in my residency, and I had this voice like inside of me, this feeling of like, I don't really like direct patient care very much. Like I don't enjoy it.
Yeah. How
And
is that saying that out loud or even
well,
inside your head?
I didn't, and I didn't say it out loud, but it was almost like, shut up, like don't let that space be, right? Because especially at the time where I trained in the early 2000s, there was so much focus on, right, the advancement of a pharmacist role and becoming a quote clinical pharmacist. And I was
Yeah.
in a training program that was leading down that pathway. And in my mind, like that was the end all be all of what a pharmacist could become, right? Working at the top of their license as a clinical pharmacist. And when that feeling comes up, it's like, oh my gosh, like how much money did I invest? How much time did I invest? And now what am I going to do? And that's the example I'm giving where even if it's not retirement, I think there's seasons of transition or understandings of what our role is as a pharmacist. And it's harder to detach those when that enmeshment in the identity, I think, is so strong.
Well, and I think the other thing that you probably can talk to me more about is that sunk cost fallacy with regard to like even leaving, like nothing that you do at YFP is related to your license, as a pharmacist, right? So
Yeah.
like talk a little bit about, if you would, Tim, about like the transition. So obviously you went, you know, into like academia and you were at Neomed and then Ohio State, and then, maybe at the prodding of myself or others, like, hey, like this is taking off. We have employees. We kind of would love to have you full time. Walk me through the evolution of that in the context of identity role or even sunk cost, from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think as you just described the journey there, like it wasn't any one moment, right? It was an evolution of like further separating out, I think, my identity and my role as a pharmacist. Like as I think about my career journey, a pharmacist is one piece of the story, right? It's one of the many roles. Like I still am a registered pharmacist. I'm still licensed. I'm now that guy who completes the CE like in the last week before it's all due because none of it's
Sessions.
relevant, right?
Yeah, right.
There's no, you can't even have personal finance CE. So if
Yeah.
ACP is listening, that needs to change.
Yeah, let's do that.
Um, but it really was a step, and I had some great mentors along the way that really helped me understand and see things that I, couldn't quite see myself, or to bring that voice to the surface. Because the more I leaned into the honesty around that, the more other doors opened. Because it really helped me see that, wait a minute, the pharmacist degree and the pharmacist license, it's not a finish line. For me, the reframe was that it was a ticket to be able to ride many different rides. And those rides can change. The visual I always go back to is that I had genuinely thought of my pharmacy career as climbing a ladder. I got the pharmacy degree. I did the clinical residency. I got the academic position. You go through promotion and tenure ranks from assistant to associate to full professor. I got there. I was 30, what, 35, 36 years old, something like that. It's like, well, now what? Now what? And the moment I started to transition the viewpoint of, hey, this isn't a ladder, but it's more like climbing a rock wall, meaning that sometimes you're going to go right, left, up, down, backwards. And it's about acquiring different skills, understanding what interests are there and how they might change over time. And that's okay. And it's not a one-way path. It's not a one-way street. And part of that opened up for me, Tim, when I made the transition from, I guess the first one would have been from my residency into community practice into academia. And eventually I left practice altogether pretty early in my career. I had so many voices externally and internally that were like, hey, if you are no longer practicing, you are going to be irrelevant and you
Yeah.
basically wasted your degree. I'm being dramatic to make the
Right,
point.
right.
And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, actually, the more I leaned into that and my interest, the more other doors opened in terms of opportunities within academia. We eventually started a business at the university. So leaning into some of the entrepreneur interests that I didn't necessarily name or understand at the moment, which led to other opportunities, which led me to go to Ohio State, which was somewhat of a lateral move, but allowed me to acquire some different skills and interests. And then eventually leaving that work in 2021 as we had been building, YFP since 2015. So it was a slow evolution. But I think that separations piece after piece really helped me eventually get to a point of like, hey, I invested $200,000. So I had $200,000 of student loan debt. I invested 6 years in the PharmD, a year in residency training. You could even argue, some of the academic career and experiences. Like, again, I'm not doing that work today, but I genuinely feel that all of that was an important part of the journey that led to stepping stones and doors being open along the way. So, could I practice in a pharmacy today? I guess legally the answer is yes, but I'm a huge liability, if I was. However, I genuinely believe that I am a valued member of the pharmacy profession and that my degree allowed me to be in a position of where I was today. But it was through that separation in part of that, hey, my identity is dependent on being a clinical pharmacist or an academic pharmacist or being successful in this role that allowed me to really open up the box a little bit to say, hey, there's a unique opportunity to impact the profession in a much different way, one that I never saw coming, right? But if we can improve the financial wellness of the profession of pharmacy, we know that has a positive impact, in the profession. But it was a painful journey, along the way to rip off some of those Band-Aids. And I'm grateful for a lot of mentors that were there, along the way.
What I remember, talking with you as you're going through the transition to YFP full time, and this is no shade on Ohio State or any large organization, but it was like, I think you had, I don't know if head trash, but it's like, what happens like when I leave or whatever, and it's like the machine goes on, right? And it's not that it's not like you don't make contributions. I even talked with my wife about this with her job. It's, and she loves her job, but when we're working, on a weekend or outside of hours, and if that becomes a habit, I'm, I facetiously say like, they don't care about you. And I'm not saying that they don't or contribution, but like, if you're part of this big machine, again, you're contributing to that, but you have to make sure that the work that you're doing doesn't necessarily impede on other things. And it goes back to the life plan of like putting first things first. But I just remember that conversation, of like where your head was. And it's like the next day, like, the sun comes up and Ohio State is still Ohio State. And
That's right.
And,
That's
but
right.
I think not that I don't know what it is, but like we just think that like, whether it's perception of others or, what's going to happen when I leave. And I've experienced this too with, some of my other, jobs and careers that I've had before YFP, but it just shines a light on how we're just part of a greater good, a greater whole. Right. And what I don't want people, and I had these discussions with my kids and my nieces, is like, the work that you do is important. It is, but don't let it consume you. Like when you're, you know what I mean? Because
That's it.
like, it has to be a mutually beneficial relationship as we talk about profession and things like that. But to kind of go back to the sunk cost, because I know the sunk cost fallacy, because I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I do think it is harder for pharmacists to overcome this because of the money, because of the time, and rightfully so. But I think the other thing is like, as an outsider, I am still very much impressed individuals that can get the PharmD, like, it's an impressive thing. So like, what are the things that you learn? Like, if you're going to completely shift away from pharmacy, which we're not saying that we should, but like, if you're going to completely shift away from pharmacy, like, I studied international relations, Tim, because I thought I would work either I would be in the military or I'd work in the government. I don't use any of that. Right. So like, what are the things from the PharmD that you can apply to other things that you're interested in? I think that's important. And I think the other beautiful thing about pharmacy is, like, you don't have to just be a type of pharmacist. You can do other things. Like, I talked with a pharmacist recently that they were all about billing. Like, that was their thing. And I'm like, I don't even think about those. So like, so there are now you have to get your foot in the door to be able to have those opportunities, but there is a breadth of things that you can do within pharmacy that you can. I think sometimes it's like, like I didn't get a residency or a fellowship. I'm stuck in XYZ.
Yeah.
But that's not true. Like, it might take a little bit more elbow grease to get it, but you can do it, right? And we've seen our clients do it. We've seen, there's people out there that help you through that. So I think it's just important to note that is like, just because the price tag can be high, it doesn't necessarily, it's like the rock climbing wall analogy that you have. Like, sometimes you might have to go back, down or sideways to then continue to climb up.
Yeah. And I think you used the word insignificance. I was thinking about perspective. Like, if we think about this as a 30 to 40 plus year journey of career, and that we were we were someone before pharmacy that didn't have an identity to pharmacist, and
Yeah.
we will be someone after pharmacy that doesn't have a direct tie, to pharmacy. If we have that type of framework, I think it shifts the perspective a little bit. And when we think about these transitions or what are some of the things that are involved, um, I like to think of my brother as an example of somebody who's done such a good job of getting out of what can be a very narrowly defined career path. And his secret sauce, which I think pharmacists would really benefit from, is the detachment from the job or the role or the degree, and a focus on what were the skills and experiences that were acquired through those various roles, and then applying that to the interests that are there. That is a complete mindset shift that opens up so many
Yeah.
different doors. So, he had a background in industrial engineering. That was his degree. He went to work for investment banking, JP Morgan, for over a decade, did some pretty cool stuff with international banking, was in one of those roles where like your bonus is bigger than your salary, doing really well. And he woke up, in his early 30s when started to have a family, and had that moment of like, wow, I'm making good money. I'm successful by all measures, but like I don't want to grind at 60 to 70 hours to go up the corporate ladder, one step after another. And so it just shattered that framework, right? And so he took actually 9 months off, moved from London back to where we grew up in Buffalo. And it was through hiring a coach actually that helped him start to look at his experience of like, oh, okay, interesting. You have an industrial engineering degree. You have these roles within investment banking. Let's put aside the names for a minute and let's start to put on paper, like, what are the experiences? What are the projects? What are the skills that you've acquired? It just happens to be that you have an industrial engineering degree. It happens to be that you worked for JP Morgan. But how can we then take those skills and experiences, pair it with interest, and then package that out to various types of interest and employer? And he's gone in many different directions since then. And I think in pharmacy, we need to apply that same mindset. Like when you go through 6 to 8 years of a pharmacy degree and maybe advanced training in residency or fellowship or job experience after that, yes, you are a pharmacist. Yes, you maybe are a hospital pharmacist or an industry pharmacist or a community pharmacist. All of that true, but like, what have you learned through those? What are the experiences? And then how could those be used within your existing role, or maybe in a pivot, or maybe even in something outside altogether, if that were to be the desire? But there's something about pharmacy, Tim, like with the sunk cost, perhaps, is it the student loan debt that, graduates are averaging $170,000? Is it the time? Is it the parental kind of voice and expectation of like, hey, you're going to be a pharmacist at age 18, 19, 20, that is then hard to detach that, or even hard to pivot? Or, hey, I've seen this with some pharmacists who have made a transition to industry recently, Tim, who maybe they did 2 years in specialized inpatient residency and like PGY1 inpatient, PGY2 and like critical care ID, worked for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they pivoted to industry, but struggled with that transition because of their quote clinical training, and that they are a hospital pharmacist, they are a residency trained pharmacist, and maybe they didn't need that to go into industry, although I would argue it certainly probably helped them, the experience. But even those transitions, I see people struggle with. So I just think it's so interesting that this is such a common thing within the profession.
I do think too that you kind of talked about a couple minutes ago that plays a part in this is kind of the evolution of the PharmD, and the pharmacist kind of trying to get that equal seat at the table as like a provider. Like I think part of that is pushing this forward as well. Of like, hey, we're trying to be a kind of an equal footing member of the healthcare team. And I think that if you're kind of brought up in that when you went to school, I think that kind of solidifies the bond a little bit more to that identity and role of like what it means to be a pharmacist. I do think that plays a part for some people for sure. I think one thing that I wanted to call out is, like that pharmacist that's transitioning maybe from like the clinical side to like industry. And I thought about this as I was thinking about launching my own firm, Script Financial back in the day, is you can always go back, right? Even for you, like if something happens to YP, which we're great, but like you can always, now you'd have to like get spun up on things, but you can always go back, right? Like that bedrock is still there. And I think like even if you're transitioning to, from a clinical role to an industry role, or even outside, I think we look at things in such a permanent lens that it doesn't afford us the ability to take risk, because we think it's like, okay, if we do this and we fail, like we're screwed. And that's not true. Like that isn't true. Like you can always go back and knowing that. And for me, like when I was going through this, of like the thought of like starting my own business versus like going to work for somebody else, that was kind of the fork in the road for me. I'm like, I'm always going to regret not doing this. I'm always going to gonna want to know if I could take something from nothing and build it into something great. And that I know I was going to have that regret. So I had to do it. Like it wasn't even a choice for me anymore at that point. And I think for some people, if they're in a place where they're like, man, it's Sunday night, Tim, I don't necessarily want to go to work. This doesn't necessarily, maybe that's what your brother was experiencing, is like, I'm doing well, but I'm just like, I don't want to grind. I don't feel fulfilled. Like, it's not necessarily a permanent thing to pivot, right? You hope it is, and you hope it, the grass is greener and all that, but sometimes it's not.
But
right. That's okay. Again, you can always go, you can always climb down the wall to then go lateral or go back up. And I think that's a great analogy. And I think sometimes we look at the decisions of like, hey, this is a permanent thing, and I'm sinking myself if I don't succeed.
Yeah, and just to take that a step further, not only can you always go back, but arguably you're going to be able to then bring different experiences that you've acquired, right?
For sure.
I think about that through YFP, like all of the things learned through building a business, right? And building a team and figuring stuff out and dealing with failure and coming up with new ideas and testing those. I mean, all of those things and skills, if it all ended tomorrow, like arguably I'm a more valuable employee today than I was 5 years ago. But that's a different mindset, and I don't think I would have had that type of confidence in saying that 10 or 15 years, or even 5 years ago for that matter. Now, maybe taking it aside, we don't want to go to on the show. I think there's also the reality of taking risk and being comfortable in saying that on the back of a strong financial foundation and strong financial plan, right? Because you're not in that golden handcuff mentality, which I think feeds into the conversation we're having right now, that if I'm in my whatever point in my career, 10 years in, 15 years in, 20, 25 years, and I have this nagging feeling of like, this is not what I want to do. And that means either a transition within the profession or out of the profession or eventually a retirement. If we aren't afforded the ability to move that from some type of thought or idea to action because of the financial foundation or plan that's getting in the way, that's a whole separate, conversation.
Yeah, we talk about optionality with regard to like retirement and like, hey, getting to that point of like no longer being able to work. But along that journey, optionality with regard to making a pivot or a move that maybe is not as lucrative, like less golden handcuffs, like that's still important, right? So again, we always say like we're biased, but that's where like a good solid foundation in financial planning can really allow you to sleep a little bit better at night, as you are kind of traversing those changes and, maybe switching one role out for another, that, is maybe more of an unknown, or just, again, not as lucrative from a compensation perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's why the financial plan, as we talk about at length on the show, is so connected to the career plan. Having the option to take some risk in your career, certainly is connected to the strength of the financial plan that you're sitting on. And that could be asking for a promotion, asking for a raise. That could be trying to create a new role within an organization, pivoting to a role outside of your current employment that maybe isn't the best fit. That could be pursuing a new opportunity, maybe outside of pharmacy. That could be reducing, hours if you're looking for more optionality of time. Any one of those, if we can build a strong financial plan, we're going to be able to approach those with confidence. And as you know well, Tim, from coaching people through negotiations of many types, financial and non-financial, if you're negotiating from a position of confidence internally, that negotiation is going to go in a completely different way because you're not in a scarcity mindset, right?
Right. Exactly right. Yeah. And I think, again, it comes with, I think, strong financial foundations
Yeah.
and also just knowing like where you want to go and for a lot of people where they're at. So many people, we talk to, it's just like, I think I'm doing okay, but I don't know. Like you would be able to tell me because you work with so many pharmacists maybe at this stage of their career and they're correct. Like I can kind of tell them, but even so, it's still relative, right? If you're, depending on like your burn rate and things like that, or like what your lifestyle is, where you live, location's a big thing. It's going to be very much relative. So at the end of the day, we just want to do, the projections and math to kind of show you that, which is kind of, again, to scratch the pharmacist's brain. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A position of strength and confidence is a lot better because it provides leverage and, just options at the end of the day.
I do think I mentioned the golden handcuffs. I'm going to go back to that for a moment because I think especially for those that are, in that, I don't know, 10, 15-year mark, maybe even those that are a little bit earlier than that. Like I remember graduating, Tim, coming out at 24,
Yeah.
where like there's this story being told of you're a pharmacist who's going to make a good income. Right. And I think this got heightened with the evolution of the PharmD, right? All of a sudden, there's a little bit of ego that's thrown in there with the doctor and the use of doctor. And I think that's directly connected to our identity conversation, because if you're 25, 26, 30, even 35 or 40, and there's been so much fed into the role of a pharmacist, the title of a doctor, the degree that was obtained, in the income that you're making, we can appreciate why that enmeshment between identity and role
Sure.
becomes so cemented, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yes. And that can be hard to kind of break out of,
Yeah.
whether it's, again, a pivot that's something not necessarily pharmacy related, or even at retirement, right? If you've been working in a profession that's, 35, 40 years, whatever that looks like, 50 years, and all of a sudden you're not that anymore in the day to day and people don't look to you. And I mean, that retirees can struggle with that for sure. And I think pharmacists in particular. So I think it's just really good to be aware and have these conversations. And, I think that's why retirement is not just a financial or even just life. It's not just a financial conversation. It's much more than that.
And one thought that just came to mind, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, is it feels like there's something in that mid-career, 40s, 50s, where the questions start surfacing, or, I gave my example of like, there's that voice inside of like, I don't really like direct patient care. And then eventually, thankfully, it came out much earlier than that. But right,
Yeah.
where we give some oxygen and some space for these maybe deeper questions that have been under the surface for a while, and they start to boil up. And it reminds me, I read a book several years ago called The Second Mountain, where they talk about this concept where, right, you're on this path for the first half-ish of your life and you're climbing a mountain. All of a sudden you get to the top and you're like, oh, there's a whole nother mountain, right, to climb that you didn't even know that was there. And that's, maybe the second half of the story. And I think there's something there with pharmacists in 40s, 50s. They've been at it for 15, 20 years. And maybe they've checked all the boxes, right? They got the degree, they did the advanced training, maybe they got board certified, they've been promoted several times within their organization. But they look up and it's like, I've still got 15 or 20 years left and I feel like I've arrived. I feel like I've checked all the boxes, like what else? And this question, I think, very much comes to the surface at this point, right? Who am I beyond my role as a pharmacist? And maybe even some of the unsettled feelings of, wow, there is a lot connected here, and I'd like to start to separate this out a little bit more. what are your thoughts on that? Is that just a natural rhythm we go through? I mean, is there a reason why, it's kind of a natural halfway point? It's a mid-career. Is it partially because, hey, this is the point where for those that have kids, we start to see our kids getting older and there's all these other variables that are involved. We finally can just lift our heads up to think about it. Like what are your thoughts?
I think it's a combination of those, but I think it's kind of that transition of kind of that scarcity mindset to like an abundance mindset, because, we've talked about this previous episodes. It's like when you get started, it's like, all right, debt, right into the 6-figure job to pay down the debt. I got to start these retirement accounts, buy a house, get married, have kids. It's just hair on fire, transition after transition. And there's just not a lot of discretionary income that goes around. And I think all the other things that you kind of mentioned with like, hey, kids are getting older, maybe you have a little bit more confidence and footing from a career perspective, but I think it's picking your head up, or you're allowing yourself to pick your head up because you feel more of the abundance of the work that you put in and less of the scarcity, that allows those self-reflective questions of like, who am I? What am I doing? Is this what I want? Am I optimized? Which is often why, prospective clients will book a meeting with me, is because they're like, hey, I think I'm doing okay and I make a good income, and, we're putting money in these different buckets, but like, I don't necessarily think that we're making the best use, or there's some bleed because we don't have, strong goals. We're just kind of throwing money different places, but we still have money just sitting there, or just it's being spent. I think it's that transition from scarcity to abundance that then leads to some of these reflective questions and conversations within about where am I at in the universe, and how can I make this better, whether that's a financial or even a career or time. You start to think about like, okay, like what does retirement look like, or winding down my career, or having a twilight career, or consultant, or doing something. So I think if I had to say one answer, I think it's the scarcity to abundance mindset that then leads to some of these deeper questions that we just didn't have the time, the space, maybe the patience to do, to talk through before.
I think aging parents is another one that's coming up for me that you and I have been talking more
Yeah.
about in the last
Yes.
few weeks, right? Because there's a natural point in time, speaking for myself, where like in my mind, my parents are just like fixed at a certain age. And obviously as time progresses and health conditions naturally come present, and other things that are there, it starts to shatter that view a little bit. And you start to see some of the finite nature of the time that you have, perhaps with your own parents, or your family, and the next generation type of evolution that's happening. And I think that puts a viewpoint on time that again gives more space for these questions, because I don't know if urgency is the right word, right? But you just start to look at it a little bit different.
Yeah. And I think, and I don't know if we've talked about this on the podcast, or I know we've talked about it one-on-one. I was kind of thinking about this with regard to more of, Zoe, my 2-year-old, where we're going through these transitions now where I'm like, this is the last of this, right? So like right now, the thing that we're trying to work through is the Binky, the pacifier, right? Which she's really in love with. Yeah. Like I pick her up from daycare, and they don't really allow her to have it at daycare, but she looks at me and it's almost like her pack of smokes. She's like, where's my Binky? I need it's pretty funny. But we need, she's 2 now, so we have to transition of that through that. And like, I remember when I used to cuddle Liam before I would put him down to bed, and, I would cuddle his back and then put him in his crib and then rub his back for a while. And I remember like pretty soon, like this is going to be, because we're going to transition from from the crib to the bed. And that was true. Right. And so I was thinking about that. So I think what that really triggers is this feeling of being present.
Yep.
And also like gratitude. Right. But I also think about it in terms of the other end of the spectrum of like, my dad turns 80 this year, and, health issues, and, we're getting together to do a camping trip for his 80th birthday, all the kids and them, and we're meeting in one spot. Everyone lives in different states except for me and my sister. But But like, in the back of my head, I'm like, is this one of the last few times that we'll all be together? I know that sounds terrible and morbid, but that's the truth of the matter, right? So I'm approaching this as very much from a place of like gratitude and being thankful, but also being really, really present, especially with, my parents, because, whether this is it or there's a handful more, I want to soak it up while I can. And I think that to what you're saying is, I'm talking about abundance, scarcity to the abundance transition. I think if you overlay some of these relationship things, as a son, or as a parent, or it could be like a sibling or whatever that is, like, I do think that these cause periods of pause, and that's a good thing. And I think like
Absolutely.
sometimes if we're so inundated with work and life, we don't take those opportunities to slow the heck down and actually think or appreciate, and it's just so easy to kind of just get caught up in the next thing or get distracted by a screen or whatever. You know, one of the questions I'll get often is like, why do you work with pharmacists? And the answer to that is, one, it was just kind of a matter of circumstance. I've talked about this on the podcast. One of my West Point buddies married a pharmacist. They became clients of mine, and then they referred me out to a lot of other pharmacists. And then when I decided to pivot and start my own business, Tim, I decided to niche to pharmacists, but it was really because I was listening to the universe and taking that message and being like, this is what I need to do. I could have just easily been like, okay, I work with a lot of pharmacists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I should work with pharmacists. So in the same way, the ability to slow down and listen and be present to what's around you is hard because life is just so hectic. And I think that's another part of this is just really slowing the heck down and, taking some rest and reflecting on. And I think that, again, I know a lot of these episodes can be, very much a commercial for financial planning, which is by design, but also not by design.
Music.
Yeah. But that is what a good financial planner is. It kind of forces you into some of those reflective conversations because we just get so busy. So like if I'm meeting with you, Tim, and I'm like, and we're talking about, retirement is, it might shift from like, can I retire to like, who will you become when you're no longer working? Or is what you're doing right now, is this your trajectory? Hey, last year we talked about you doing X, Y, and Z, and we're doing it. So like, what's next? Or we're not doing it. So like, what needs to change? So that is what I think it's not just about the ones and zeros, right? It's about, having those questions and those deep conversations because we only get this one life, right? And we want to make the most of it. And, all the things that we've talked about before. So I know this is Tim's, let me step off the soapbox. But
Preach it.
It can be a little bit tangential to, kind of the identity and role. But I do think that, those last, whether it's, a 2-year-old baby or my 80-year-old dad, I think being able to slow down and really recognize that is a gift in itself.
You mentioned this question of who am I when I enter in retirement? I want to talk about that a little bit further because this is so important for our listeners and certainly relevant to what we're talking about here today, which is the pharmacist identity trap and this connection between identity and role. When we think about retirement, typically it's one that we're thinking about towards anticipation and excitement, or usually that's the conversation, right? I'd like to get to a point someday in the future where I'm no longer dependent on working my 9 to 5 to be able to fund my expenses, and there can be some type of relax and leisure and do all the things, right, that we wanted to do.
Yep.
Oversimplifying, of course, just for the conversation. And so we talk about saving a certain amount of money to get there, and we work our whole career to get there, and hopefully we wake up and we've got X amount saved, and we plan for that, and we've crossed all the T's and dotted our I's. But what we don't talk a whole lot about is that emotional transition into retirement, right? So I've been working for 30, maybe 40 or more years. I've spent my career probably on some level associating my identity as a pharmacist. And now I'm not. Now I'm not. Now, some people might work part-time. Some people stay actively involved and organizations are doing different things. But nonetheless, we're no longer associating ourselves, at least in the same way that we were. So there's that. And then there's also this aspect that even in work situations that are challenging, Tim, I think we tend to underestimate the feelings of contribution, right? Even if we're in a work situation where like, it's not ideal, just that sense of contributing, helping patients, I'm working with providers, working with other colleagues, right? I have a value and a purpose and a sense of contribution. And now that's gone too. And so we might get to this position where we wake up and we're like, I've done all the things I wanted to do that we planned for and prepared for. I've got the dollars, I've got the resources, we can do all the leisure activities, but I didn't anticipate this, right? I just didn't anticipate these feelings of void and what might be present in retirement as I've made this transition from a career that I identified with for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I'm chuckling to myself a little bit because I remember, like when I kind of stepped out of like, the financial planner role to really manage the team and work on the front end with business development and prospecting and things like that. One of the things that I was scared of is like what are my clients going to do without me if I'm, moving them to a different planner? And it was like not even a thing. So you're talking about like patient care. It's like the people on our team.
Now they love Kim and Angel. It's like,
yeah,
they're just Tim. Who?
Yeah. Like get Scram guy. Like they're and obviously you have to have a capable team that connects with people and they're really technically sound. But I'm sure a lot of pharmacists are that are transitioning or thinking about transitioning and work with patients or a team or whatever have that, right? And yeah, I think so much about this is like I said, many people think of retirement as, primarily a financial transition. And, what we're talking about here is role exit, where, this is the process of leaving a role that has been central to your identity. And the challenge is that many people often prepare financially for these transitions, but they neglect the identity transition. And then retirement arrives and, retirees today struggle with depression, substance abuse because of that. And I don't know if it's any more prevalent now versus in times gone by, or if we just talk about it a little bit more. I don't think we talk about it enough. But, back in the day, you might be with a company. My dad worked for the same company for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
He was there, so, you could see that identity really enmesh versus maybe there's a little bit less of a loyalty. We don't have pensions or those types of golden handcuffs. So that, transition from job to jobs are a little bit more. But, I think at the end of the day, the income replacement problem can be solved, but the identity replacement remains. Like that is something that is kind of a little bit more abstract, maybe. Many retirees discover that they're not just leaving a job, they're kind of leaving a major piece of who they believe themselves to be.
Yeah.
So, I do think that this is an important conversation to continue to have. And I do think a good financial planner can talk through this and, who are you beyond your profession? What roles matter to you most? Which identities are growing stronger? What are fading, right? And we talked about this end of history idea of that, like my life 5 years from now will be similar to what it is. And it's not, like change is inevitable. So I think that diversifying roles and trying out different roles and seeing what sticks is really important, but it's harder now than ever to do that, I think.
That's right.
And we can talk about that a little bit more, but yeah, I think the big thing here is, there is a fear for some behind retirement because they recognize this. But I also think there's a lot of people that are overconfident in this, that underestimate, life beyond their role as a pharmacist, that can get in trouble, especially if they don't have those strong foundations, not just from a financial perspective, but just from a, role in a community, those types of things that they can be lost, and it can lead to things that are not necessarily great from health and wellness perspective.
And this is such a good example of why we talk so much about developing a financial plan that allows us to live a rich life today and tomorrow, right? Because if we're just focused on tomorrow without prioritizing today, part of the prioritizing today is to prepare ourselves for the emotional transition into retirement, not just spending. We talked about the importance of building a spending muscle for those that are hyper savers, but also you mentioned, a couple things, right? Whether it's community, hobbies, faith, relationships, right? All these things that, when I think about my own journey, Tim, I had a lot of hobbies and interests, and then pharmacy school happens, life happens, and like they get beat out of you. And you have to work hard to bring those back. I love to read. I love to compete and play sports. I love to go watch sporting events. We started playing poker with a group of guys a couple years ago. Like you have to work to bring these things back. And I think the point here is we can't wait until retirement to start to bring some of these things back. I think there's a trap that probably from, commercials and advertisements of, showing the beaches and the vacations and retirement that like, we'll enjoy that someday. Like we need to bring retirement into the present day as well, because that's going to help us transition emotionally and make sure that we're not just ready financially, but also like, are we retiring to something, right? Are we retiring to the hobbies that we already enjoy? Are we retiring to the relationships that we've already and have been investing in? Are we retiring into the community and into the friendships and into our, our centers of faith and all these different things and service activities, et cetera? If we're able to do those and really lay the seeds, even if some seasons of life, we can't invest the time that we would want to, can we keep the momentum going so that it's not just someday we'll get to those things?
I think that this is harder than, previous generations. Just that ability to
Which piece?
like the ability to like connect and build like community. I'll give you an example that, yesterday was the kids' first day of like summer swim. And, we have a lot of good relationships with other parents and my kids, with swim. But today's the first day, or yesterday was the first day. And a lot of the kids, there's a lot of new swimmers. So they have to basically get across the pool to, be able to make the swim team essentially. And so like, there's just a lot of parents, standing around, but a lot, like so many were just like on their phone, like, and it's
There's
just
no
tough.
space, right?
It's just tough to meet people organically. And I think like if we have like awkward silences, it's like, it's just, get your phone out and, be buried there. And, I think we're always on our device. So we're so connected, Facebook and social media, but we're so disconnected. And
Absolutely.
this is adults included. So, and we've talked about this, Tim, with like, so many people today, in versus like previous generations are transient, right? Like I grew up in the Philadelphia area in New Jersey, you grew up in Buffalo. We don't live there. So like, I think to be able to build a community is tougher, especially when people move a lot. We're connected, but we're not. We're divided, even though most people agree on most things. So it's really like you really have to make an effort for this. And if you don't view this as important, you're like, oh, it's the someday I'll get to this, or when I retire.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's just important to be aware of. And one of the reasons like I wanted to start playing poker is to build a sense of that a little bit. Like, like I said, I didn't grow up in Columbus. Most of my buddies from college and high school, they just live everywhere, so like we will go and visit, but having kind of that at home base is really important too. And so like I think I told you, Tim, that my son's gotten really big into ice hockey. So like I am taking ice skating lessons, and I grew up rollerblading and doing a little bit of ice hockey, but like I am putting myself out there and looking like, not the most graceful person, But part of that is to build my own community and obviously support my son. But that is a heavy lift because I'm taking time out, I'm spending money, making myself vulnerable because I'm out there with mostly kids.
Might tear your ACL in the
Yeah,
process.
might tear, exactly right.
Yeah.
So like these are not easy things to do.
Yeah.
But if we kind of talk about diversification from a role and identity perspective, or a role perspective, I should say, like these are things that I think are necessary. And again, that'll fade in the future. I'm not always going to like be his ice hockey coach or play ice hockey myself. But, I'm willing to kind of put myself out there to see where it goes. So yeah, I just think it's something that, I'm really grateful for this conversation, because it's just something that I know like we've kind of talked around a bit, and, it's been a kind of tertiary conversation to the broader financial plan and things like that. But I think it's something that it deserves its own spotlight because it's not talked about enough.
I want to wrap up with just a handful of questions to get the listeners thinking a layer deeper or two. So the first question is, if you couldn't introduce yourself using your job title, how would you describe yourself? Right. We talked a lot about the pharmacist identity and role. The second question is, what parts of your life currently give you meaning outside of work? What are those areas that you feel like there is some fulfillment and joy and meaning and purpose outside of work? If you retired tomorrow, how would you fill your calendar? I know you talk about this in the life planning process, right? What would a normal day, what would a normal week look like? Let's get out the calendar and actually start to project that out. Who would you be if pharmacy was gone from the equation for whatever reason? How would you define yourself? How would you think about the day and the calendar? And then finally, a theme that we've been talking about towards the second half here: are you building wealth only for retirement, or are you building a life worth retiring into? And how do we prioritize investing in those experiences and in those activities today? So Tim, great stuff. As always, this was a fun one, and I think one that we'll point back to maybe for some time. So we'll be back at it here in a couple weeks. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scripted Wealth, Money and Meaning for Pharmacists. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share the show with a friend or colleague. It really helps more pharmacists discover the show and join us on the journey toward living a rich life today and tomorrow. And if today's episode got you thinking about your own financial plan, retirement goals, or what a rich life means for you, we'd love to help. You can learn more about our fee-only comprehensive financial planning services by visiting yfbwealth.com. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information of the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information, you can visit yfbwealth.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.